Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gertie Mai Muise. I'm the Executive Director of the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centres. Thank you all for joining us today for this important announcement. To help us get started in a really good way, we have asked our ceremonialist, our knowledge keeper, Michael White, to provide us a land acknowledgement and an opening prayer. And after he's done his opening prayer, we will have welcoming remarks from our Madam President, Jen Dockstader. So with that, I will ask Michael to come to the podium.
Bonjour. Ozoi makwasan bon indish na cause makwana dodem. Trontung the donchi. Migosh mishomis, kiboa seji and nogum. Migosh the kinokam gishikak. Hoyinichi go up magnuiji pamaris. Migosh commission medium, commission the beach, commission the sewing. Sema bagdana wabanang medok, jaunang medok, nakapihanang medok, hiwednang medok. Jimishko gaboyan zonga de ion. Qua migoch kanagego ajik tot, migoch sin. Miigwech mitigok, miigwech wisin yeg. Ema miigwech mishomisan nogomisan Anishinaabe, mishomisan nogomisan ongwehoe. Ochi miigwech.
Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the OFIFC board, staff, and 29 Friendship Centres, welcome to the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centres. Yao go to Michael White for the land acknowledgement and opening, and for keeping our traditions sacred. It is our honour and privilege to host Ontario government ministers in our urban home. Honourable Mr. Rickford, Honourable Mr. Tobolo, Honourable Minister McKenna, Honourable Minister Dunlop, Honourable Sylvia Jones, and Honourable Doug Downey. I would like to acknowledge the support of all the Ministry and Federation staff for working behind the scenes to help us make this day special. I'd like now to introduce Associate Minister of Mental Health and Addictions, Michael Tibollo, to provide his remarks. Yawa.
Miigwech, thank you and good afternoon, everyone. And also thank you to Minister Rickford for the incredible work that he does with the Indigenous communities and his leadership. Since I was sworn in as Ontario's first Associate Minister of Mental Health and Addictions, I have met many Indigenous leaders and have visited many Indigenous communities in rural, remote, and underserved regions across the province of Ontario. And I've personally witnessed the overwhelming need to improve supports and services. For too long, for far too long, Indigenous peoples and communities have faced many barriers to accessing effective, culturally appropriate, and safe mental health and addictions care. We know that more needs to be done, especially as a result of the pandemic. And we also acknowledge that the trauma suffered by Indian residential school survivors, as well as the intergenerational trauma to their families and communities, requires a focused commitment to ensure that culturally appropriate services are there for anyone who needs them, no matter where they are in the province of Ontario. And that's why I'm pleased to announce that as part of the $36 million being invested today, more than $16 million in annual funding will be focused on cross-governmental investments in Indigenous services supporting the implementation of our Roadmap to Wellness. This includes more than $10 million in annualized funding to expand culturally safe and Indigenous-led mental health and addiction services for Indigenous peoples living both on and off reserve. This will be used to support culturally adapted child and youth mental health services delivered by Indigenous organizations. Fund urban Indigenous organizations to expand services to First Nation, Inuit, and Métis individuals off reserves. fund Indigenous-focused supports through the Ontario Structured Psychotherapy Program, enhance mental health, mental wellness teams, and expand treatment beds across the province. In addition, nearly $6 million will support culturally safe and Indigenous-led mental health and addiction services through cross-government investments. And I want to acknowledge the fact that many of the ministers engaged and involved are here present today. This is a sign of our intention to work together across ministries to ensure that the services are provided to the individuals that are in need and that they are effective across ministries and that we do continue working together. And those funds will be used to support culturally safe mental health and addictions programming, outreach and aftercare to remanded inmates and sentenced offenders at 4 correctional institutions. It's going to provide funding for provincial territorial organizations and urban Indigenous organizations to address the increase in opioid use and opioid-related deaths. It's going to support 2 specialized healing lodge programs for Indigenous children and youth in the care of children's aid societies and at high risk of human trafficking. And it will fund the development of a culturally responsive mental health framework to support Indigenous students transitioning from grades 8 to grade 9. With this investment, we're taking an essential step in building productive working relationships and ensuring Indigenous communities throughout the province have access to culturally appropriate mental health and addiction support when and where they need them. As we always say, there is no health without mental health. Thank you so much, Miigwech, and I'd now like to introduce my colleague, Associate Minister Jane McKenna. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Tobolo. I'd like to thank you for joining us here this afternoon. I also want to congratulate Glen Hare on his election as Ontario's Regional Chair back in June. Chief Hare has been an outspoken advocate for the well-being of First Nations children. I want to thank Minister Rickford and Tobolo for their strong support in addressing issues facing Indigenous children and women in our province. On May 27th, our province announced Pathways to Safety, a government-wide action plan to address the root cause of violence against Indigenous women. Later that same day, the discovery of remains at a former Kamloops Indian residential school in British Columbia was reported. This turned out to be the first of many. In the months that followed, unmarked burial sites were discovered at many former residential school locations across the country, bringing painful memories back. We cannot undo the tragedies of the past, but we can ensure that Indigenous communities across Ontario have the support and resources they need to heal from intergenerational trauma. This includes continued support for Indigenous-led community-based programs such as the Family Wellbeing Program and the Indigenous Healing and Wellness Strategy. We worked with First Nations, Inuit, Métis, and urban Indigenous partners to co-develop programs that help reduce violence against Indigenous women, children, and families, and to improve healing, health, and wellness. Our government is committed to working in collaboration with residential school survivors, affected families, Indigenous elders, leaders, and communities so that their voices can guide our path forward. I'll turn it over to Minister Rickford to provide details on the initiatives we are announcing today. Miigwech.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Gertie. The board, Michael, thank you for getting us started in a good way today. What are we here for? Well, we could actually have quorum. I think we could have a cabinet meeting if we wanted to. How about that, Gertie? But as Michael says, this really tells you about a whole-of-government approach, the level of seriousness and understanding and engagement, frankly, Regional Chief Hare, in the recent past around a stronger action oriented approach to mental health and addiction. It's what we're here for today. That's right. And I want to thank the folks here for the extraordinary opportunity. I think it's fitting, given the services that you provide, that we're here today, somewhere near the longest street in the world that stretches right out across treaties in this vast and beautiful province. So thank you to the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centres and for the work that you do throughout our province. We recognize, of course, that Toronto was a gathering place for many Indigenous nations, including the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and Métis people. And I acknowledge that we are meeting in the area covered by Treaty 13, also known as the Toronto Purchase, and I pay my respects to the Mississaugas of the Credit. And as a person who lives on the beautiful Treaty 3 lands way out in northwestern Ontario, to feel their spirit with us here today. It's been described, colleagues and partners, as an endemic within a pandemic. I think it's important to think about that. As somebody who's spent a great deal of their professional lifetime living and working in Indigenous communities across this country and predominantly here in Ontario, I've seen firsthand the intergenerational, as the phrase or saying goes, impacts of Indian residential school, no question, but obviously various other barriers and challenges, some of them imposed by the degrees of isolation in the far parts of northern Ontario, rural, sometimes just access to services even here in our largest city centres. And as my colleagues have said, there is no question that the only way that we can endeavour to get this right is to work closely with the partners who deliver those services and programs. But maybe just back up for just a moment. To take our cue from the leaders, from chiefs and councils and various working groups that feed important information, not just about what is required, but how it can actually get to those communities and have impact. It starts with culturally appropriate, trauma-informed supports that are readily available on the ground in the communities as work is undertaken to investigate and support things like the Indian residential school legacy and its impacts. Of course, there are various other mental health and addiction conditions that, not unlike broader society, can sometimes be more impactfully on display in very small and often closed communities, especially the isolated and remote communities up north. I think it's fair to say that we understand the pandemic has disproportionately impacted Indigenous peoples, especially those living with mental health and addiction challenges. Access in First Nations and urban Indigenous communities has been limited, and we hope today we're taking a powerful and important step forward to change that. That's why Indigenous partners have proved to be so important in coming to an understanding of how we can best provide those services. Obviously, it starts with being well-resourced, but also build on and complement existing supports available, as Michael alluded to, the Roadmap to Wellness, focusing on Indigenous-led initiatives that are community-driven, that use holistic approach and draw on the rich and powerful history that I've seen firsthand in Indigenous communities across this country and most notably in this province. Our government will continue to work with Indigenous partners, and that's why today I'm announcing $36 million in Indigenous-focused mental health and addictions and trauma supports. If you'll just indulge me for a few moments, I want to break that down. From my own ministry, the Ministry of Indigenous Affairs, we'll be providing critical mental health and trauma supports for Indigenous communities participating in the Indian residential school identification, investigation, protection, and commemoration processes. This is on top of the $10 million that we have committed to that process, more broadly speaking. $10 million is from the Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services to provide flexible community-based funding that can be put towards locally identified needs on the ground, including supports for children, for youth, for women, families, communities, and individuals, including Indian residential school-related mental health and addiction needs. Thank you, Joe, for your cooperation and your support in what we're doing here today. $4.76 million from the Ministry of Education to provide targeted mental health and addiction supports for Indigenous students in our schools. Thank you, Regional Chief, for your input in those regards, and Minister Lecce for the work that we continue to do in our Indigenous classrooms. Funding to expand the Indigenous Graduation Coach Program to intermediate students in and on boards already participating in the program. The Ministry of Colleges and Universities to provide mental wellness supports for Indigenous post-secondary schools attending Indigenous institutes. I appreciate this as well. Joe, you're doing a lot of important work in this area, and you served us very well in the Ministry of Children and Community and Social Services, and we appreciate Minister Fullerton's contributions. Minister of Attorney General to increase access to Indigenous-specific victim healing services and justice sector information to support families through the Family Information Liaison Unit. When this is working, Doug, it works really well, and I want to thank you for your partnership today. All of the ministers here today have presided over the information and the engagement that we have put together for the purposes of today's announcement, and I want to thank all of them. It means a lot to me, and I know Regional Chief Hare, but I know that it will mean an incredible amount to the communities across Northern Ontario who need our support, and that's what we're here today. So I want to thank you for this extraordinary opportunity to be here, and I'm going to turn it over to Regional Chief Hare to say a few words.
Ani, Wuro, Mache, Sagoli, Ani, hello. Migat, Mike, it's talking again. Glen Dishner, Castle, Gwen Gosner, Schnabber, Nosen, Chigging, Donji. Again, thanks, Mike, for opening our day here today. My name's Gwingos, that's my Anishinaabe name, given by my elder. I'm from Chigging First Nation on Manitoulin Island, and I'm the Ontario Regional Chief. As we all heard, first I want to thank the government that's standing with us here today. It's exciting. I'm getting used to the role of the Ontario Regional Chief, how big, how vast the land and the people that we're responsible to look after. As we heard the minister say, we're in a pandemic within a pandemic. And we know all too well what that means since COVID started. The recognition of the needs for mental health wellness funding is appreciated, as this is an area that has been underfunded for many years. We are under crest of the perfect storm of the opiate crisis, the pandemic, and now recent residential school explorations for unmarked children's graves. This is going to result in an incredible increase in the need for supports this has already started. The announcements all indicate funding for Indigenous initiatives. We will need to know what distinctions-based allocations are meant for First Nations, so we look forward to discussions with your ministries on how these funds will be distributed and accessed by First Nation communities. And I'd just like to expand on that. It's, you know, since COVID hit, I want to say miigwech to the government, how we've been working government to government with us. It's awesome. I only hope that we do carry on how we've been working from here forward. Because again, the people that we represent are watching and listening to us. We know that the needs are greatest at the community level and at all the communities across Ontario. We need to sit with the leadership and listen to them, because they are the ones that are fighting every day. They look to us for days like this and many more, I hope, so we can move forward. Indigenous organizations need to be accountable and ensure that they do provide the services in a culturally competent way and are meeting the needs of all First Nations within communities and the urban centers. Funding for some issues such as children with developmental delays could also affect programs under Jordan's principle, so we might look forward to a discussion with federal partners for a trilateral discussion. Cross-governmental funding that is needed, intended to support similar programs at the community level, even with different focuses, can create an additional reporting burden on communities if they have to report differently to each ministry. Therefore, an integrated reporting system to avoid separate funding reports to several ministries for a common program would be helpful. We can't lose sight of the other needs for First Nations that are not mentioned here today, such as health, human resources are needed to meet the needs of communities. While funding for positions are important, we need additional training and supports to make sure there are enough well-qualified people available to fill them positions. Long-term care, home and community care programs need culturally relevant programs and supports. There do not seem to be any enhancements here from the Ministry of Long-Term Care. Funding for people with disabilities, accessibility issues, for access to treatments, and for people who are experiencing homelessness, which can only be within communities and or in urban locations, is also critical to meeting our needs. So once again, I want to say miigwech to the government, to the Premier's office, and I do mean that we have worked well in the last year and a half. So again, with that, I say miigwech, and we have lots to look forward to and lots of work. Miigwech.
We will now go to the phone line for questions. Just a reminder, it's one question and one follow-up. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen on the phone, as a reminder, if you have a question, please press *1. Your first question comes from Laura Stone with the Globe and Mail. Please go ahead.
Hi there. My question is for Minister Rickford, and I'm hoping that Regional Chief Hare can also weigh in just regarding the decision that we're expecting today from the federal government on whether to appeal the federal court decision on the child welfare funding. Minister, do you have anything to say about what you think the federal government should be doing in this circumstance? As Regional Chief Hare, if you're also able to weigh in on what you think should happen today? Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. I appreciate the question. In a technical sense, it's still before the court, so it's probably not available for me to speak about it. That said, I've appreciated the position of Regional Chief Hare, and I'll turn it over to him very shortly. Look, our focus here today is on providing the resources for Indigenous-led mental health and addiction treatment and support, services and programs, improving access across this province given its vastness, and a particular emphasis on children in challenging situations and their families, mobilizing community-based initiatives and support, Laura, so that when it's appropriate, they can receive the care that they need in their communities. And frankly, if they have to move beyond that community to go to an appropriate Indigenous-led environment for potentially more complex care and support, all with the objective, of course, to improve and build on healthy family initiatives, some of them reflected here today that they'll support. And we believe that in the context of healthier families, that this would be less of an issue moving forward. And I'll save any other comments on the historical elements of this for the court decision and anything that Regional Chief would like to add.
I'm running on empty here. Well, very, very short, because all eyes and ears are on the deadline, which is tonight. So I don't have very much to say about that until we see what we're going to hear. So things are still going, and we're eagerly waiting what we're going to hear also tonight. So I'll leave it at that. I don't want to cause any phones ringing. So.
Follow-up?
I guess I'll try. I mean, Regional Chief, if you could say, you know, what if it turns out that the federal government does appeal? I mean, there's only two options here, so I am hoping for your perspective on what you think could happen here and what you would like to see.
Well, again, you know, the decision was in our favor, so we leave it there. Again, I can't say very much because we don't know what we're going to hear from the government tonight. And imagine there'll be a lot of questions tomorrow, but I'll be on the road. So I'm going to leave it at that. We do have our legal people. I have my leadership. This is very much right in front on my table right now, but I have to wait till tonight. I don't want to ruin that process. Greg.
Thank you, everyone.